The ink on the divorce papers wasn't even dry when Richard poured the champagne. He laughed a loud, jagged sound that echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom, mocking the woman who sat across from him. He thought he had won. He thought stripping Isabella of her title, her home, and her shares in the company they built together was the final victory. He watched her hand shake as she signed everything away, convinced he was looking at a broken woman. But Richard forgot the first rule of business: never celebrate until the check clears. Because what he didn't know was that the empire he just stole was already burning to the ground. And Isabella. She wasn't shaking from fear. She was shaking from holding back a smile. The air in the conference room of Sterling Dynamics always smelled of expensive leather and ozone, a scent that Richard Sterling claimed was the smell of money. It was located on the 45th floor of the Salesforce Tower in London, overlooking a city that Richard believed he owned. At 10:00 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday, Richard stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Savile Row suit. He checked his reflection, smoothing back his silver fox hair. At 52, he was the picture of modern success, CEO of the year, a tech visionary, and as of noon today, a very wealthy bachelor. "Stop pacing, Rick. You're making me nervous," a voice purred from the mahogany table. Richard turned to smile at Jessica Tate. She was 28, sharp as a tack, and currently the CFO of his company. She was also the reason his marriage to Isabella was ending, though Richard preferred to think of it as a strategic realignment of his personal life. "Nervous," Richard scoffed, walking over to pour himself a glass of sparkling water. "There is nothing to be nervous about, Jess. The lawyers drafted the settlement exactly as we discussed. Isabella gets the beach house in Cornwall, which is rotting with damp, by the way, and a lump sum of £2 million. In exchange, she forfeits all claims to Sterling Dynamics, including the voting rights attached to her founder shares. It's a slaughter." Jessica tapped her manicured nails on the leather folder in front of her. "It feels too easy. Isabella isn't stupid. She has a PhD in mathematics, Rick. She wrote the core code for the predictive engine 10 years ago. "That was 10 years ago." Richard dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand. "She hasn't stepped foot in this office since we went public. She's been too busy gardening and playing the suffering wife. She doesn't know the valuation has tripled in the last 6 months due to the upcoming merger with Kensington Tech. She thinks the stock is stagnant. By the time she realizes she signed away a £100 million asset for a pitiful $2 million, the ink will be dry, and we'll be drinking Dom Perignon in the Seychelles." Richard's phone buzzed. It was a text from his lead attorney, Arthur P. Blackwood, a man known in London, legal circles as the Vulture. "She's in the elevator. She's alone." "Showtime." Richard grinned. He sat at the head of the table, assuming his power pose, shoulders back, chin up. He wanted Isabella to feel small. He wanted her to feel the weight of the institution she was being expelled from. For years, Richard had carefully orchestrated this moment. He had slowly gaslit Isabella, convincing her that the business was failing, that they were drowning in debt, and that he was the only one keeping the wolves at the bay. He hid the financial reports, routed mail to a P.O. box she didn't know about, and moved assets into shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He had created a reality where he was the martyr, and she was the burden. The heavy oak doors creaked open. Isabella Sterling entered. She looked nothing like the vibrant, sharp-witted mathematician he had married 20 years ago. She wore a grey, shapeless raincoat that looked like it had been bought at a charity shop. Her hair, usually a chestnut cascade, was pulled back into a severe, messy bun. She carried no designer handbag, just a tattered tote bag and a wet umbrella that dripped onto the pristine carpet. Richard exchanged a smirk with Jessica. "She looks defeated," his eyes said. "Isabella," Richard said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Thank you for coming. I know this is difficult." Isabella didn't look at him. She didn't look at Jessica, who was blatantly wearing the diamond tennis bracelet Richard had bought, using the company account, technically Isabella's money. "Let's just get this over with, Richard," Isabella said, her voice raspy, as if she hadn't spoken in days. She pulled out a cheap plastic chair and sat down, clutching her tote bag to her chest. "Arthur isn't here?" she asked, looking around the room. "Mr. Blackwood is on a call, but he's prepared everything." Richard lied smoothly. Blackwood was actually in the next room, watching via a hidden camera feed, ready to burst in if Isabella showed a spine. But looking at her now, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, Richard knew the lawyer wouldn't be needed. "The documents are in front of you," Richard said, sliding a thick stack of papers across the mahogany. "It's exactly what we discussed last night. You get the house, the car, and the cash settlement. I take the debt, the company, and the stress. It's a generous offer, Bella. More than you deserve, considering you haven't contributed to the bottom line in a decade." Isabella stared at the papers. Her hand trembled as she reached into her bag. Richard expected her to pull out a tissue. Instead, she pulled out a pair of reading glasses, cheap pharmacy ones, not her usual prescription frames. "You're really doing this, Richard?" she whispered, looking at the cover page. "After 20 years, you're trading me in. It's business, Bella." Richard sighed, checking his Rolex. "We've grown apart. I need a partner who understands the speed of the modern world. You just want to be comfortable. This deal gives you comfort." Jessica chimed in, unable to help herself. "It's for the best, Isabella. Really. Richard has been under so much pressure. He needs freedom to save the company." Isabella finally looked at Jessica. For a split second, the fog in Isabella's eyes seemed to clear, replaced by something cold and sharp, like a scalpel glinting in the dark. But it vanished so quickly, Jessica thought she imagined it. "Save the company," Isabella repeated slowly. "Yes, someone has to." The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass. Richard watched Isabella flip through the pages. She wasn't reading them. She was just turning them, her eyes unfocused. Good, he thought. If she actually read Clause 14, Section B, she'd realize she was indemnifying me against all future lawsuits regarding the intellectual property. "The pen," Isabella murmured. Richard uncapped a Mont Blanc fountain pen, the one she had given him for their 10th anniversary, and held it out to her. The symbolism was cruel, and he relished it. "Here," he said. "Sign where the stickers are." Isabella took the pen. Her fingers were pale, devoid of the wedding ring she had worn for 2 decades. She hovered the nib over the signature line on the first page, the asset division agreement. "Richard," she said, pausing, "are you sure the valuation listed here is correct?" £2 million for my half." Richard's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his face like stone. "Bella, the company is under water. You know that. I'm taking out a loan just to pay you that $2 million. I'm doing you a favor. If we liquidated today, you'd get nothing." It was a lie. A brazen, quantifiable lie. The internal audit on Richard's laptop, currently sitting 3 feet away, valued the company at $400 million. "I see," Isabella said. "And the Kensington merger. The rumors in the Financial Times?" Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound. Fake news. Market speculation. There is no merger. Kensington wouldn't touch us with a barge pole in our current state. That's why I need full control to fix the mess. Isabella nodded slowly. Okay. If you say so, Richard. I've always trusted you with the numbers. You have, he said, leaning forward, his predator instincts kicking in. And I've never let you down. Sign it, Bella. Go to Cornwall. Be happy. She lowered the pen. Scritch. Scratch. She signed. Richard felt a rush of adrenaline so potent it was almost sexual. She signed the asset division, then the non-disclosure agreement, then the transfer of stock. With every signature, Richard became richer. You're going fast. Jessica noted, her voice tinged with suspicion. Don't you want to call your lawyer? I thought you hired Simon P. Sterling from the city. Isabella didn't look up. Simon advised me against this, she said softly, signing another page. He said Richard was hiding assets. He said I should demand a forensic audit. Richard stiffened. Simon P. Sterling was a shark. If he was involved, why was Isabella here alone? But Isabella continued, turning the page. I fired him this morning. Richard let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. You fired him? Why? Isabella looked up, and this time there was a tear running down her cheek. Because I just want it to be over, Rick. I don't want a fight. I don't want to drag our names through the mud. I just want out. Smart woman. Richard grinned, glancing at Jessica. Simon would have just drained your bank account for fees. This is cleaner. Cleaner, Isabella echoed. She reached the final page. This was the big one. The irrevocable power of attorney and assignment of IP rights. This document transferred the ownership of the Argos algorithm, the code. Isabella wrote the code that was the company solely to Richard. She hesitated. Richard, she asked, her voice trembling, does this include the Black Box project? Richard froze. The Black Box project was the new military application of her old code. It was the secret source of the Kensington merger. It includes everything, Bella, Richard said, his voice hardening. Don't get sentimental about code you wrote in a basement 10 years ago. It's obsolete. I need the rights to update it. If you don't sign that, the deal is off. No 2 million. No beach house. He was bluffing, and he prayed she wouldn't call it. Isabella looked at the paper. Then she looked at Richard. For a moment, the air in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop. Isabella sat up a little straighter. The tremulous quality of her hands vanished. You're right, she said, her voice suddenly clear, devoid of the raspiness from earlier. It is obsolete. She signed the paper with a flourish, capping the pen with a loud click. Done, she said. Richard snatched the papers away before she could change her mind. He quickly checked the signatures. They were all there. Isabella v. Sterling. Well, Richard said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He felt like he was floating. He had done it. He had pulled off the heist of the century against his own wife. I'm glad we could be adults about this. He looked at Jessica. Champagne. I think so. Jessica beamed. Isabella stood up. She picked up her wet umbrella and her tattered tote bag. She didn't look sad anymore. She didn't look defeated. She looked, bored. Goodbye, Richard, she said. Enjoy the company. I will, he laughed. Enjoy Cornwall. Try to fix the roof before it caves in. Isabella walked to the door. Her hand rested on the brass handle. She paused, not turning around. "Oh, Richard. One small thing," she said. "What is it?" "Did you need cab fare?" Richard mocked, already popping the cork on the bottle Jessica had retrieved from the mini-fridge. "No," Isabella said. She turned her head slightly, just enough so he could see her profile. A small ghostly smile played on her lips. "I didn't fire Simon P. Sterling this morning." Richard paused the bottle, hovering over the glass. "What?" "I didn't fire him. I told him to wait in the lobby until I sent him a text. He's down there with the representatives from the Financial Conduct Authority." Richard's blood ran cold. "The FCA? What are you talking about? And that document I just signed?" Isabella gestured vaguely to the stack Richard was guarding like a dragon. "The one transferring the company to you." "Yes," Richard demanded, stepping forward. "I hope you read the timestamp on the validity clause," Isabella said. "Because as of 800 AM this morning, Sterling Dynamics doesn't own the Argos algorithm anymore." "That's impossible," Richard spat. "The IP is locked in the company vault." "No," Isabella said, opening the door. "The IP was leased to the company. By me. The lease expired at midnight, and since you were too busy planning your victory party to read the renewal notice I sent 3 months ago, I sold it." You what?" Richard dropped the champagne bottle. It didn't break, but it foamed over onto the expensive carpet. "I sold it. To Omnicorp," Isabella said, naming the largest, most ruthless competitor in the market. "For £300 million. The money is already in a trust in Zurich. You just signed a deal to take full ownership of a shell company that owns nothing but office furniture and about," she glanced at the ceiling, £15 million in debt. Richard stood paralyzed. The silence in the room was deafening. Isabella walked out the heavy door, clicking shut behind her, with the finality of a coffin lid. The silence that Isabella left behind was heavier than the heavy oak doors she had closed. For 10 seconds, the only sound in the boardroom was the fizz of the expensive champagne soaking into the carpet. "She's lying," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at Richard, waiting for him to laugh, to tell her it was just one of Isabella's desperate final plays. "Richard, tell me she's lying." But Richard Sterling wasn't laughing. He was sprinting toward the conference table where his laptop sat. His hands, usually steady enough to sign multi-million-pound checks, were shaking so violently he missed the enter key twice. "The server," Richard muttered, sweat beading instantly on his forehead. "I need to check the IP repository." He logged into the Sterling Dynamics mainframe. He navigated to the secure folder labeled Project Argos. This folder was the heart of the company. It contained the source code that predicted stock market fluctuations with 98% accuracy. It was the reason Kensington Tech wanted to buy them. It was the collateral for the £15 million in loans Richard had taken out to fund his lifestyle and Jessica's apartment. He clicked the folder. A dialog box popped up on the high-definition screen. It wasn't the usual password prompt. It was a red box with white text. "Error 404, asset not found. Directory path invalid, license key expired." "No," Richard gasped. "No, no, no." He hammered the keyboard. He tried the backup servers. Error 404. He tried the cloud mirrors. Access denied by system administrator root user I. Sterling. "She wiped it," Richard screamed, his voice cracking. He spun around, eyes wild. "She deleted the code. That's sabotage. We can sue her for destruction of corporate property." Suddenly the door to the adjoining room flew open. Arthur P. Blackwood, the lead attorney, burst in. But the arrogant smirk was gone. His tie was loosened, and he was sweating profusely. He held a tablet in his hand, his knuckles white. "She didn't delete it, you idiot!" Arthur roared. It was the first time Richard had ever heard the lawyer raise his voice at a client. "She migrated it. I just got an alert from the patent office." Arthur threw the tablet onto the wet table. It showed a filing update from the UK Intellectual Property Office. Transfer of ownership. Argos, predictive engine. From Sterling Dynamics lessee to Omnicorp Global Holdings. Effective date today, 08:00 AM, GMT. Status valid. "The lease," Arthur hissed, pacing the room like a caged animal. "She mentioned a lease. Richard, did you ever actually read the founding documents 10 years ago?" "I don't read the technicalities, Arthur." "That's what I pay you for," Richard yelled back. "I didn't write the founding documents," Arthur shouted. "Isabella did. She incorporated the company before you two were even married. She leased the IP to the company for a 10-year term for £1 a year. It was a tax loophole. Or so we thought." Jessica slumped into her chair, her face draining of colour. "So, ma'am, the company we just fought to keep, the one Isabella just signed over, is an empty box," Arthur finished grimly. "We own the furniture, the lease on this office, and the debt. But the product, the thing that generates the revenue, it's gone. It belongs to our biggest competitor." Richard felt the room spin. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. "We can fix this. We can challenge the sale. We can claim duress." "Duress?" Arthur laughed, a manic, terrified sound. "You just spent an hour on a recorded line bullying her into signing the settlement. You made her sign a waiver, saying she had received independent legal advice. You handed her the pen. If we go to court, that recording will be Exhibit A." Then the reality hit Richard. "The loans," he whispered. The room went deadly silent. "What loans, Richard?" Jessica asked, her voice high and thin. I personally guaranteed the bridge loan from Barclays," Richard stammered. 15 million. I put the IP up as collateral. I told the bank we owned it outright." Arthur Blackwood stopped pacing. He stared at Richard with pure horror. "You pledged assets you didn't own as collateral for a bank loan. I thought I owned them. I'm the CEO. That's bank fraud, Richard," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That is federal bank fraud. That's not a lawsuit. That's prison." Arthur immediately grabbed his briefcase. He started shoving his papers inside. "Where are you going?" Richard demanded. "I'm leaving," Arthur said, snapping the briefcase shut. "I am terminating my representation effectively, immediately. I was not aware you were committing fraud. I am not going down for this." "You can't leave me." Richard lunged for him, but Arthur was faster. He headed for the door. But before Arthur could reach the handle, the double doors swung open again. This time, it wasn't a lonely wife in a raincoat. 4 people walked in. They wore dark blue windbreakers with yellow lettering on the back. The man in front was tall with a face like carved granite and eyes that had seen every white-collar crime in London. "Richard Sterling?" the man asked. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Richard couldn't speak. He just nodded. "I'm Agent Graves with the Financial Conduct Authority, working in conjunction with the Serious Fraud Office," the man said, flashing a badge. "We have a warrant for the seizure of all electronic devices and financial records associated with Sterling Dynamics, and you personally." Behind Graves, 2 officers moved toward the laptop. Another moved toward Jessica. "Miss Tate?" an officer asked. I'm just the CFO." Jessica stammered, clutching her diamond bracelet. "I just do the payroll." "Then you'll want to explain the unauthorized transfers of company funds to your personal accounts listed in the audit we received this morning," the officer said calmly. "Please step away from the table." Richard watched as his world dismantled in real time. The champagne was still foaming on the carpet. The settlement papers, his victory, sat on the table, a monument to his own stupidity. "Who sent you?" Richard croaked, looking at Agent Graves. "Was it Isabella?" Agent Graves looked at Richard with mild curiosity. "Isabella Sterling, no. We received a tip-off and a complete forensic dossier from a Mr. Simon P. Sterling. He's been gathering evidence on your shell companies for 6 months. Richard felt his knees give way. He sank into the chair Isabella had just vacated. "She knew," Richard whispered to himself. "She knew the whole time." 45 floors down, the rain had turned into a typical London drizzle. Isabella walked out of the revolving doors of the Salesforce Tower. The air tasted sweet. It tasted like ozone and exhaust fumes. But to her, it tasted like freedom. She didn't look back at the glass monolith. She didn't need to see the chaos unfolding on the 45th floor. She had run the simulations in her head 1,000 times. She knew the probabilities. She knew Richard's psychology better than he knew himself. A sleek black Bentley Mulsanne pulled up to the curb, splashing a little water onto the pavement. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out, holding a large black umbrella. He was in his late 50s, wearing a tweed suit and round spectacles. He looked like a kindly university professor. But Simon P. Sterling was the deadliest forensic accountant in the city. He was no relation to Richard, a coincidence that Isabella found endlessly amusing. "Mrs. Sterling," Simon said, bowing his head slightly as he shielded her from the rain. "Or should I say, Ms. Vance?" "Sterling is fine for now." "Simon," Isabella said, a genuine smile breaking across her face as she slid into the leather interior of the car. "I want Richard to keep seeing that name on the subpoenas." Simon got in beside her and closed the door, sealing out the noise of the city. The car pulled away smoothly into the traffic. "How did it go?" Simon asked, opening a silver thermos and pouring 2 cups of tea. "Textbook," Isabella said, taking the cup. He didn't read the documents. He was too busy gloating. He signed the indemnity clause. He accepted full liability for the company's debts in exchange for my shares. "Brilliant," Simon chuckled. "And the IP transfer confirmed at 8:01 a.m., Isabella said. "Omnicorp's tech team has already locked the servers. Richard is currently the proud owner of a digital ghost town." Simon took a sip of tea. "I just received a text from my contact at the FCA. They've secured the floor. Agent Graves is on site. They're seizing the computers." Isabella nodded, looking out the window at the passing grey buildings. It should have felt triumphant, but mostly she just felt relief. "You know," she said softly, "I gave him a chance. 3 months ago, I put the lease renewal on his desk. It was right on top of his Golf Weekly magazine. If he had just opened it, if he had just asked me about it, I would have renewed it. I would have let him keep the company." "But you knew he wouldn't," Simon said. "I calculated the probability," Isabella corrected him. "Given his narcissism scores and his obsession with the merger, there was a 94% chance he would ignore any paperwork that didn't have a check attached to it. And the other 6%, I had a backup plan." Isabella shrugged. "But I prefer this one." The car phone buzzed. Simon looked at the caller ID. "It's the buyer." He pressed the speakerphone button. "Isabella." A deep, gravelly voice filled the cabin. "Hello, Sebastian," Isabella said. Sebastian Cross was the CEO of Omnicorp. 10 years ago, Richard had fired Sebastian from Sterling Dynamics in a public, humiliating tirade claiming Sebastian lacked vision. Sebastian had gone on to build a rival empire that dwarfed Richard's. "Is it done?" Sebastian asked. "It's done," Isabella confirmed. "The code is yours. The keys are in your secure drop." "And Richard, the FCA is with him now." There was a pause, and then a low, satisfied laugh from the other end. "You're a dangerous woman, Isabella. Remind me never to divorce you." Isabella smiled. "You have to marry me first, Sebastian, and we have business to discuss. I'm not just selling you the code for cash." I know. Sebastian sighed, though he sounded amused. "Clause 7. You want a seat on the board." "Chairman of the board," Isabella corrected him. "And I want to head the new AI division. The Argos algorithm is 10 years old, Sebastian. It's a dinosaur. I've been working on something new in my greenhouse in Cornwall. Something better." "Better than Argos?" Sebastian asked, his voice sharpening with interest. "Argos predicts the market," Isabella said, her eyes gleaming. "My new system, it influences it. It identifies the butterfly effect points in the data. It doesn't just watch the wave. It creates it." Silence on the line. The value of what she was describing was incalculable. "I'll have the papers drawn up," Sebastian said instantly. "Welcome to Omnicorp Isabella Corp." "Thank you, Sebastian. Oh, and one more thing. Yes, when you announce the acquisition of the IP tomorrow morning, make sure you issue a press release stating that Sterling Dynamics is not an affiliate partner or subsidiary of Omnicorp. I want the stock market to know exactly what Richard owns." "You want to tank his stock," Sebastian said. "Kick him while he's down." "No," Isabella said, watching the rain streak the window. "I want to ensure that when the bank seizes his assets to pay back the fraud, there's nothing left to auction. I want him to understand what it feels like to have zero equity, zero leverage, zero control." "Ruthless," Sebastian murmured. "I love it. See you at the board meeting on Monday." The call ended. Simon looked at Isabella with a mix of awe and fear. "You really have been working on a new algorithm?" "Of course," Isabella said, opening her tote bag. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook filled with complex equations. "What else was I going to do while Richard was out with Jessica gardening is relaxing Simon. But math is power." She patted the notebook. "Richard thought I was the woman behind the man," she said. "He forgot that I was the brain behind the business. He fell in love with the interface, but he never understood the code." The Bentley turned a corner, heading toward the private airfield, where a jet was waiting to take Isabella to Zurich to sign the final papers. "Do you want to stop anywhere before the airport?" Simon asked. "Celebrate," Isabella thought for a moment. "No. I just want to check my bank balance." Simon handed her his iPad. She logged into her secure Swiss account. Balance 302,000 pound. She stared at the number. It was just a number. It didn't fix the 20 years she had wasted. It didn't fix the betrayal. But as she looked at it, she realized it did buy one thing. It bought a future where she never had to ask anyone for permission ever again. "It'll do," she said, handing the iPad back. Back at the tower, Richard Sterling was being led out of his office in handcuffs, a jacket draped over his hands to hide the steel. Paparazzi tipped off by an anonymous source Simon were already gathering in the lobby. But Isabella didn't care about that anymore. She was already writing the next chapter. The holding cell at the Charing Cross police station was painted a colour that could only be described as despair grey. It smelled of stale urine and industrial cleaner, a far cry from the ozone and leather of the Sterling Dynamics boardroom. Richard Sterling sat on the hard wooden bench, still wearing his bespoke suit, though now the tie was gone confiscated as a suicide risk, and the shirt was wrinkled. He had been sitting there for 6 hours. "I need to make a call," Richard barked at the guard for the 10th time. "I demand to speak to Arthur Blackwood." The guard, a burly man who looked like he'd spent the morning dealing with drunks and pickpockets, didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Your solicitor already came and went, mate. He said he's not representing you." "Then get me my phone. I have contacts. I have the Home Secretary's personal number." "Your phone is evidence," the guard said flatly. "Sit down." The heavy metal door buzzed and clanked open. A woman walked in. Richard's heart leapt. "Jessica!" He scrambled to his feet, relief flooding his veins. "Thank God. Did you bring the bail money? Did you get into the offshore accounts before they froze them?" Jessica Tate stood on the other side of the bars. She wasn't wearing the diamond tennis bracelet anymore. She was wearing a modest blouse and slacks, looking noticeably less glamorous than she had that morning. Beside her stood a solicitor Richard didn't recognize. She didn't look happy to see him. In fact, she looked at him with the same detached disgust one might have for a dead rat on the subway. "I'm not here to bail you out, Richard," Jessica said, her voice devoid of the purring warmth he was used to. "What then? Why are you here?" "Miss Tate is here to inform you that she has entered into a plea agreement with the Crown Prosecution Service," the solicitor beside her said. Richard blinked. "A plea agreement?" "I'm turning Queen's evidence Rick," Jessica said, crossing her arms. "I gave them the Cayman account numbers. I gave them the falsified audit logs from 2023. I gave them the emails where you told me to cook the books until they're well done." You traitor!" Richard lunged at the bars, gripping the cold steel. "I made you. I bought you everything. You're just as guilty as I am." "No." Jessica stepped back, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "I was just an employee, following orders from a tyrannical CEO. That's the narrative anyway. And since I'm the one handing them the smoking gun, I'm looking at probation and a fine. You, however," she looked him up and down, "you're looking at 10 to 15 years for aggravated fraud and embezzlement." "Why?" Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "We were partners. We were partners when you were rich," Jessica shrugged. "Now you're a liability. And honestly, Rick, you were getting boring. All that talk about being a visionary. Isabella was right. You really didn't understand the business at all." She turned to leave. "Wait," Richard screamed. "Jessica, you can't leave me here. What about the merger? What about Kensington?" Jessica stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, didn't you hear Kensington pulled out? But the market is rallying. Omnicorp just announced a new strategic partnership. Their stock is up 12% in after-hours trading. They have a new chairwoman." She paused for effect. "They say she's a genius." The door clanged shut, leaving Richard alone in the silence. An hour later, a new lawyer entered. He was young, disheveled, and carried a briefcase that had seen better days. He introduced himself as Mr. Timothy Holt, the duty solicitor. "Mr. Sterling," Holt said, sitting on the plastic chair outside the cell. "I've reviewed the charges. It's robust." "I don't want a public defender," Richard spat. "I want a real lawyer." "With respect," Holt sighed, rubbing his temples. Your assets have been frozen by the High Court. Your personal accounts, your company accounts, even your pension. You can't afford a real lawyer. You're stuck with me." Richard sank onto the bench, putting his head in his hands. "What are my options?" he mumbled. "Well," Holt flipped through a file. "The evidence provided by your ex-wife and Miss Tate is comprehensive. The forensic trail is airtight. The prosecution is offering a deal. A deal. Plead guilty to 3 counts of bank fraud and 1 count of corporate malfeasance. They'll recommend 8 years. You'll be out in 4 with good behavior." 8 years. Richard looked up, horrified. "I can't go to prison. I'm Richard Sterling." "Mr. Sterling," Holt said gently. "The alternative is going to trial, and if you go to trial against Isabella Sterling, I mean, she's listed as the primary expert witness for the prosecution. I've seen her witness statement. She has math on her side. She has tracked every penny you stole down to the decimal point. If a jury sees that they won't give you 8 years, they'll give you 20. Richard stared at the concrete wall. He closed his eyes and saw Isabella's face in the boardroom, the way she had looked at him not with anger but with boredom. "She planned this," Richard whispered. "She planned the whole thing." "From what I can tell," Holt noted, looking at the complex timeline in the file, "she started planning this 18 months ago, right around the time you bought the yacht." Richard let out a dry, broken laugh. He had named the yacht The Bachelor. "She wins," Richard said. 6 months later. "The Old Bailey is the most famous criminal court in the world. It is a place of high drama, where the fate of murderers and thieves is decided. But today, courtroom number 1 was packed with business journalists and tech bloggers. This was the trial of R.V. Sterling, or as the tabloids called it, the divorce of the decade." Richard sat in the glass-enclosed dock. He had lost weight. His silver hair, once perfectly coiffed, was now thin and grey. He wore a cheap suit provided by the court. He looked less like a CEO and more like a tired, defeated old man. He had rejected the plea deal. His pride wouldn't let him plead guilty. He convinced himself that he could charm the jury, that he could explain it was all a misunderstanding, a technical error. He was wrong. For 3 days, the prosecution had dismantled his life. They showed the emails. They showed the bank transfers. Jessica Tate had testified with tearful and fake remorse, painting Richard as a manipulative monster who forced her to fudge the numbers. But everyone was waiting for the final witness. "The prosecution calls Isabella Sterling." A murmur went through the gallery. The heavy doors opened. Isabella walked in. She was unrecognizable from the woman in the raincoat. She wore a tailored navy power suit that screamed quiet luxury. Her hair was styled in a sharp, elegant bob. She walked with a grace and confidence that sucked the air out of the room. She took the stand. She swore the oath. "Mrs. Sterling," the prosecutor. A sharp woman named Miss Hargreaves began. "Can you explain to the jury your role in Sterling Dynamics?" "I was the co-founder," Isabella said, her voice clear and melodic, "and the primary architect of the Argos algorithm." "And when did you become aware of the defendant's financial irregularities?" "On November 14th, 2023, Isabella said. "I noticed a discrepancy in the dividend yields. I ran a variance analysis. The numbers didn't add up. The probability of such a variance happening naturally was less than 1 in a billion." "What did you do?" "I continued to observe," Isabella said calmly. "I needed to gather a statistically significant data set to prove intent. I didn't want to accuse my husband of a crime based on an anomaly, so I built a background program, a daemon that mirrored his keystrokes and financial approvals." Richard gripped the railing of the dock. She had been spying on him. While he was sleeping, while he was bragging about his success, She was recording every move. "And what did this program find?" Ms. Hargreaves asked. Isabella looked directly at Richard. Her eyes were cold. "It found that Richard was siphoning capital from the R&D budget to pay for a lifestyle we couldn't afford. It found that he had leveraged the company's IP, which he did not own, to secure loans he could not repay. It found that Sterling Dynamics was, mathematically speaking, a Ponzi scheme." "Objection." Richard's lawyer, the weary Mr. Holt, stood up half-heartedly. "Prejudicial language." "Sustained," the judge said. "The witness will stick to the facts." "The fact," Isabella corrected herself, "is that the liabilities exceeded the assets by a factor of 10. The company was insolvent." "Thank you," Ms. Hargreaves said. "Now, Mrs. Sterling, the defense claims that you trapped the defendant, that you withheld information about the IP lease expiration to entrap him into committing fraud. How do you respond?" Isabella turned to the jury. "I sent 3 registered letters reminding him of the renewal. I put a calendar invite in his Outlook. I left the contract on his desk. Richard is a CEO. It is his fiduciary duty to read contracts. I didn't trap him. His own negligence trapped him. I simply stepped out of the way of the falling debris." The jury nodded. They liked her. She was smart, composed, and undeniably the victim who had fought back. "Your witness," Ms. Hargreaves said. Mr. Holt stood up. He knew this was a losing battle. "Mrs. Sterling, you sold the IP to Omnicorp for a significant sum, did you not?" "I did." "So you profited from your husband's downfall?" Isabella tilted her head. "I profited from my own invention, Mr. Holt. My husband's downfall was a separate variable. Correlation does not imply causation. Richard fell because he broke the law. I succeeded because I built something valuable. They happened simultaneously, but one did not cause the other." "But you knew," Holt pressed. "You knew signing those divorce papers would trigger his arrest." "I knew there was a high probability," Isabella admitted. "But Richard had a choice. He could have read the papers. He could have been honest. He could have treated me with respect. If he had done any of those things, the outcome would have been different. He chose his path. I just calculated the result." Richard couldn't take it anymore. "You witch!" he shouted from the dock, standing up. "You cold-hearted witch! You set me up. You wanted this order." The judge banged the gavel. "You were nothing without me." Richard screamed, his face red. "You were just a housewife. I was the face. I was the star." Isabella looked at him. She didn't flinch. She just leaned into the microphone. "You were the interface, Richard," she said, her voice amplified through the courtroom. "But an interface is useless without the code, and I was always the code." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard slumped back into his chair, defeated. He knew, and everyone in the room knew, that it was over. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. "Richard Vance Sterling," the judge intoned, peering over his spectacles. "The jury has found you guilty on all counts. The scale of your deception was matched only by your arrogance. You took advantage of the markets, your investors, and your spouse. This court sentences you to 12 years in His Majesty's prison." Richard didn't scream this time. He didn't cry. He just felt numb. As the bailiffs cuffed him and led him away, he scanned the gallery one last time. He saw Jessica Tate, who refused to meet his eyes. He saw his former business rivals, who were furiously typing on their phones, no doubt tweeting about his demise. And he saw Isabella. She stood at the back of the room, next to a tall man in a dark charcoal suit, Sebastian Cross, the CEO of Omnicorp. As Richard passed them, Isabella didn't smile. She just nodded a small, polite acknowledgement of an equation balanced. 2 years later. HMP Ford is an open prison, a far cry from the high-security holding cells, but it was still a cage. Richard spent his days in the prison library, stacking books. It was mindless work, but it gave him time to think. He had a lot of time to think. He thought about the Black Box project, the military application, the one thing he was sure Isabella hadn't accounted for. He knew she had sold the commercial rights to Omnicorp, but the military contracts, those were classified. They were tied to his personal security clearance. He still had one card to play. If he could just get a message to the Ministry of Defense, he could trade the secrets of the Black Box for a reduced sentence. He could claim he was the only one who understood the encryption. "Sterling," a guard called out. "Visitor." Richard perked up. He wasn't expecting anyone. Jessica had moved to Bali. His friends had abandoned him. He walked into the visiting room. Sitting at a small metal table was not a lawyer or a general. It was Isabella. She looked radiant. She wore a simple white dress and a large sun hat, looking like she had just come from a garden party. "Hello, Richard," she said. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, sitting down warily. "Came to gloat? Or did you run out of money?" "I have plenty of money, Richard," she said softly. "I came because, well, I needed you to sign something." Richard laughed, a harsh, rusty sound. "Sign something? You took everything. What is left to sign?" Isabella slid a single piece of paper across the table. It wasn't a legal document, it was a technical schematic. Richard looked at it. His eyes widened. It was the architecture for the Black Box. "You're trying to sell it," Richard realized. "You can't. It's classified. You need my key." "I don't need your key, Richard," Isabella said, "because the Black Box doesn't exist." Richard froze. "What?" "The Black Box project," Isabella explained, "was a simulation. I created it 5 years ago to distract you. I knew you wanted a military contract to boost your ego. So I wrote a program that looked like a high-level encryption tool. It generated impressive-looking data, flashy graphics, top-secret protocols. But underneath, it was just a random number generator. No." Richard shook his head. "I saw the demos. It worked. It worked because I was controlling the demo from my laptop in the next room," Isabella said. "It was a magic trick, and you fell for it. You spent 3 years pitching a fake product to the Ministry of Defense." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "But I took money for that project. I took millions in government grants." "Exactly," Isabella said. "And that's why I'm here. The Ministry of Defense just finished their audit of the Black Box project. They realized it's vaporware. They are preparing to charge you with treason and defrauding the government." "Treason," Richard squeaked. "Unless," Isabella tapped the paper, "unless you sign this confession stating that you were solely responsible for the deception and that no other employees or spouses were aware of the fraud. If you sign this, they'll treat it as simple fraud. 5 more years added to your sentence. If you don't, they'll bury you in a hole so deep you'll never see the sun again." Richard stared at her. "You set me up again? You let me pitch a fake product?" "I didn't let you do anything," Isabella said, standing up. "You stole the files from my private server. You pitched it without my permission. You were so eager to steal my genius that you stole my garbage." She placed a pen on the table, a cheap plastic prison pen. "Sign it, Richard. It's the best deal you're going to get." Richard looked at the pen, then at Isabella. He realized finally the true depth of her intellect. She hadn't just beaten him at business. She had turned his own greed into a weapon and handed it to him barrel first. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen. He signed. Isabella took the paper. She didn't say goodbye. She just turned and walked toward the exit. "Isabella!" Richard called out, his voice desperate. "Was any of it real? The marriage, the 20 years, did you ever love me?" Isabella paused at the door. She looked back, her silhouette framed by the bright light of the outside world. "I loved the man I thought you were, Richard," she said, "but that man was just a projection, a bad interface. I finally fixed the glitch." The door closed. Richard Sterling sat alone at the metal table. He looked down at his hands, empty, shaking and powerless. Outside, the sun was shining, but in his world, the screen had finally gone black. What a brutal checkmate. Richard spent his whole life thinking he was the player, never realizing he was just a pawn in Isabella's master game. He stole her genius, only to find out he was stealing his own destruction. It just goes to show, never underestimate the person who knows your passwords and your secrets. Who do you think was more ruthless, Richard, for his greed, or Isabella for her revenge? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We have an even crazier story of corporate betrayal coming next week. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.